Margaret Collins stood by the window of her cozy Kent cottage, watching the morning mist swirl softly over the fields. The familiar countryside seemed peaceful as ever, but inside her heart, a quiet storm was brewing. Today was the day Edward, her only son, would leave for London to pursue his career. At 35, Edward was determined to make his mark in the city, and Margaret understood that well. Yet, as she watched the bus stop just beyond the garden gate, her thoughts drifted to the years when Edward was a boy, running barefoot across these fields. Now, those carefree days felt like a distant memory. Margaret had always been proud of her son's ambition, but the emptiness his departure would leave was hard to ignore. The house felt suddenly too large, too silent. She could almost hear the echoes of laughter and the clatter of dishes that once filled every corner. As Edward boarded the bus with a small suitcase in hand, he turned briefly to wave goodbye. Margaret smiled, though her eyes glistened with unshed tears. She whispered to herself, "It's his time now." Margaret knew that life would change dramatically. The village, once bustling with familiar faces and neighbors stopping by for a chat, had become quieter over the years. She had her own routines, but the thought of long days without Edward was daunting. Still, Margaret was not one to surrender to loneliness. She carried a strength nurtured by decades of challenges and joys. This was a new chapter for both of them, and deep inside, a small spark of excitement stirred. Perhaps this was the moment to rediscover herself. The morning sun climbed slowly over the horizon, casting golden light across the quiet Kent village. Inside the cottage, Margaret Collins moved through the rooms with a strange mix of nostalgia and determination. The familiar creak of floorboards and the scent of old wood greeted her, but the house felt hollow without Edward's presence. Margaret had spent the first hour making the bed in his room, folding the blankets with care as if trying to preserve the moments they had shared there. Every corner held a memory, the framed photographs on the mantelpiece, Edward's childhood drawings pinned to the kitchen wall, the worn armchair by the fireplace where they often sat reading stories on rainy days. Now, the house was quieter, yet Margaret was resolved not to let silence turn into loneliness. She brewed a pot of tea and settled by the window, looking out at the garden where the roses had just begun to bloom. She thought about what lay ahead, a life reshaped by change and the challenge of finding new purpose. That afternoon, she decided to take a walk through the village, hoping to reconnect with neighbors she hadn't seen in months. As she wandered past the quaint cottages and the small bakery with its inviting aroma of fresh bread, she felt a faint flutter of hope. Margaret stopped at the community hall notice board, scanning the flyers for local events and clubs. Among them was an announcement for a tea shop opening soon in the village center, a place for locals to gather, share stories, and support each other. The idea sparked something inside her. Perhaps this was the opportunity she needed. Over the next few days, Margaret began researching what it would take to open a tea shop of her own. She spoke with friends, local shop owners, and even a business advisor who volunteered at the council. The more she learned, the more excited she became. This was not just a business venture, it was a chance to build a new community space where people could feel at home. Yet, despite her optimism, doubts crept in during the quiet evenings. Would she be able to manage the shop on her own? Could she keep her spirits high when Edward was miles away chasing his ambitions? Margaret knew these questions would not disappear overnight. One rainy evening, as she sat by the fire with a book, the phone rang. It was Edward. His voice was warm but hurried, filled with the stresses of city life. He spoke of long meetings and deadlines, but also of missing home and the simple pleasures he left behind. Margaret listened carefully, feeling both pride and sadness. They promised to visit each other soon, but neither knew what surprises the future held. That night, as the rain tapped softly against the window panes, Margaret felt a quiet resolve settle within her. The road ahead was uncertain, but she would face it with courage. Edward was finding his path in London. Now it was her turn to find hers in Kent. Days turned into weeks, and Margaret's life in Kent began to settle into a new rhythm. Each morning she woke with a sense of purpose that had long been absent from her days. The idea of opening her own tea shop no longer felt like a distant dream but a goal that was gradually taking shape. Margaret spent her mornings visiting local suppliers, tasting different blends of teas and sampling homemade cakes from village bakers. She kept a small notebook where she jotted down ideas for the shop's menu, decoration, and special events. The prospect of creating a welcoming space for her neighbors filled her with quiet excitement. In the afternoons, she worked on refurbishing an old, vacant storefront in the village center. The paint was peeling, and the windows were dusty, but Margaret saw potential where others might have seen only neglect. She imagined sunlight streaming through those windows, casting warm patterns on wooden tables, while the hum of conversation filled the air. The villagers began to notice Margaret's efforts. Neighbors stopped by to offer advice, old friends dropped in with baking tips, and curious passers-by peered through the shop's front windows. Encouragement came from unexpected places, and Margaret felt a deepening connection to the community that had always been there but somehow distant. At the same time, messages from Edward arrived less frequently. He was caught up in the fast-paced London life, meetings, clients, late nights. The gap between mother and son seemed to stretch wider, yet Margaret held no bitterness. Instead, she cherished the moments when they did talk, sharing small details of their lives and dreams. One afternoon, as Margaret was arranging freshly cut flowers on the shop's counter, a local journalist from the Kent Gazette stopped by. She was writing a feature on new businesses bringing life back to the village and wanted to include Margaret's story. The interview was simple but meaningful, capturing Margaret's hopes and the excitement building around the new tea shop. That evening, as Margaret sat alone in the fading light, she felt a surge of pride. The shop was no longer just a plan, it was becoming a reality. Yet, beneath the surface, a quiet question lingered: would Edward ever truly understand this new chapter of her life? Margaret pushed the thought aside. For now, she was exactly where she needed to be, building something with her own hands, step by step. The tea shop was more than a business, it was a symbol of renewal, friendship, and the unexpected joys that come from embracing change. Just as Margaret was settling into her new routine, an unexpected letter arrived at her doorstep. The envelope was plain but bore the emblem of a London law firm. Her heart quickened as she broke the seal, curious and uneasy all at once. Inside was a notice regarding the legal status of her late husband Edward's will. It stated that a dispute had arisen concerning some assets, including a small property Edward had quietly acquired in London years ago. The letter warned that the matter could affect her financial standing if unresolved. Margaret read the words again and again, feeling a knot tighten in her chest. She had never imagined that after Edward's passing, she would face complications she had no idea about. Questions raced through her mind: what was this property, why had Edward kept it secret, and who was contesting the will? Determined to protect what was hers and what she had built, Margaret contacted the law firm and arranged a meeting. The following week, she traveled to London, a city that once held so many memories but now felt distant and cold. At the law office, Margaret met with Mr. Hastings, a sharp and meticulous solicitor who explained the situation clearly. Edward's will was being challenged by a distant relative who claimed entitlement to the property. The dispute was complicated and could drag on for months, possibly years. Margaret listened carefully, weighing her options. She could fight the claim, but it would require time, money, and emotional energy she wasn't sure she had. Alternatively, she could consider a settlement, but that might mean losing a valuable asset she hadn't even known about. As she left the office, Margaret felt the weight of uncertainty settle over her like a heavy cloak. The peaceful life she had begun to build in Kent suddenly seemed fragile. Yet beneath the worry, a fierce determination burned. She would not let shadows from the past dictate her future. Back in Kent, Margaret found solace in the daily tasks of the tea shop. The friendly faces of villagers and the comforting routine helped her push aside the legal battle looming in London. Still, each night she went to bed with the letter in her mind, knowing the fight was far from over. One evening, as she closed the shop, a neighbor stopped by with news. The tea shop was gaining popularity, and a local radio station wanted to feature Margaret's story. The recognition brought a small spark of joy amidst the growing challenges. Margaret smiled, feeling the strength of her community wrap around her like a warm blanket. No matter what the future held, she knew she was not alone. Margaret's days grew busier as the tea shop flourished. The once quiet village street was now alive with chatter and laughter, a far cry from the solitude she had experienced after Edward's passing. The radio feature had brought new customers, and business was thriving. Yet, the looming legal battle still weighed heavily on her mind. One morning, while sorting through some letters, Margaret found an unexpected note slipped inside the law firm's envelope. The handwriting was unfamiliar but neat. The note read, "If you need help navigating this, you are not alone. Let's meet." It was unsigned. Curious and cautious, Margaret decided to reply. She sent a brief message through the solicitor, agreeing to meet whoever had sent the note. A week later, she met a man named Daniel at a quiet cafe in Canterbury. He introduced himself as a distant cousin of Edward's, someone who had been involved in family matters but had remained out of the spotlight. Daniel explained that he had also been surprised by the will dispute and wanted to offer his support. Margaret was wary but found his knowledge and sincerity reassuring. Daniel shared information about the contested property. It was a small flat in an up-and-coming area of London that Edward had purchased years ago, perhaps as an investment or a secret refuge. Together, they discussed possible strategies to resolve the dispute. Daniel's contacts and understanding of family dynamics could prove invaluable. Despite the complicated history, Margaret felt a spark of hope. Perhaps this alliance would help her secure her future. Back at the tea shop, Margaret poured her worries into her work. She planned new events to attract visitors and began teaching a weekly tea appreciation class. The shop was becoming more than a business, it was a gathering place, a community hub. Late one evening, after locking up, Margaret looked out at the peaceful village under a sky full of stars. She thought about Edward, the past she was still untangling, and the future she was determined to shape. With allies beside her and a community behind her, Margaret knew the road ahead would be challenging but not impossible. It happened on a dusky Thursday evening, just as the golden light of sunset filtered through the old lace curtains of the tea shop. Margaret was in the back room, going through a box of Edward's belongings that Harrison had returned earlier that week, a gesture she hadn't expected, and one she approached with caution. The box smelled faintly of cedar and dust, filled with cufflinks, handkerchiefs, and old notebooks. But nestled beneath a worn leather diary was a small, faded envelope. Her name was written on it, in Edward's familiar, slightly slanted handwriting. Her breath caught. She sat down slowly and opened the letter, hands trembling. "My dearest Margaret," it began. "If you are reading this, then I am gone, and I'm sorry for all the pain that may come after me. I know there are things I should have told you, and I never found the courage. But I have always trusted your strength, your heart, and your ability to find truth through the fog." Tears welled in Margaret's eyes as she continued. "There is a property, the flat in Chelsea. I purchased it under my name long before we moved to Surrey. It was never meant to be a secret. I simply didn't know how to bring it up after the loss that surrounded it." Margaret paused. "Loss?" The letter continued. "The flat belonged to my brother Julian, before he passed unexpectedly. I couldn't bear to let it go. I told myself I would keep it in his memory. But in doing so, I made it a shadow in our life, rather than a light. I kept the paperwork away, quietly maintained it, and never thought it would become something you'd need to fight for. If Harrison is causing you pain, I'm truly sorry. He's long believed I owed him more than time gave me a chance to provide. But know this, everything that matters, I intended for you. And I believe in the legacy you'll create, not from wealth, but from resilience. Forgive me if you can. Love always, Edward. The room was silent, save for the tick of the old wall clock. Margaret folded the letter carefully and held it to her chest. It wasn't just the content of the letter that moved her, it was the realization that Edward had struggled with his own guilt and grief, and had wanted to protect her, even if clumsily. The next morning, with the letter tucked safely in her bag, she visited Daniel. "I have something," she said as they sat in his study. "Something that may help." Daniel read the letter twice before looking up at her. "This changes everything," he murmured. "Not just the property, but your position in this whole matter. This proves intent, Margaret. Edward wanted you to have it." They quickly arranged a meeting with the solicitor, preparing to submit the letter as evidence in the ongoing dispute. Meanwhile, Harrison remained silent, but not idle. Margaret noticed a marked shift in his behavior. He stopped answering calls from the solicitor and avoided direct communication. She suspected he had realized the tide was turning, though he would never admit it. Still, Margaret didn't celebrate. Not yet. There was too much left unsettled. But she could feel it, the edge of victory. Not for the sake of triumph over Harrison, but for the sake of restoring what had been taken from her. Back at the tea shop, the regulars began noticing her change in spirit. There was a new steadiness in her step, a spark in her voice. And when she hosted the next tea evening, she wore Edward's old watch, the one he used to wear on their Sunday walks. A quiet tribute. The world was slowly righting itself. Not perfectly, but honestly. The sun had barely risen when Margaret stepped onto the cobbled pavement outside her tea shop. The air held a chill, but her heart felt oddly steady. She knew the letter had changed the course of everything, but something inside her whispered that the story wasn't quite finished. Later that afternoon, a formal brown envelope arrived at her cottage in Surrey. It bore the emblem of Cavendish and More, the firm that had handled Edward's affairs. Margaret hesitated before opening it. The last time she received a letter from them, it had marked the beginning of the chaos that had threatened to consume her world. She sat at the kitchen table, the kettle whistling faintly in the background. With careful fingers, she opened the envelope and pulled out a folded legal document, an amended version of Edward's will. Her name was at the top of the page. But this wasn't just about the Chelsea flat. Her breath caught as she read through the lines. It seemed Edward had, in the months before his death, revised his will a second time, this time without Harrison's knowledge. In addition to the tea shop and the cottage, Edward had named her the primary beneficiary of a trust fund that had been previously unknown to her. It wasn't vast wealth. But it was enough. Enough to secure her independence for the rest of her days. Enough to expand the tea shop, should she wish to. Enough to fund a future she could shape on her own terms. And then, tucked in the last page, she found it, a personal note, typed, not handwritten, as if Edward had prepared it formally to be discovered like this. "Margaret," it began. "You always told me I was too quiet when it mattered most. I suppose you were right. This is my way of finally raising my voice, even if I'm no longer here to see your reaction. I wanted to ensure that you would never be at the mercy of others, not even Harrison. I was proud of everything you built in this life. But I regret the times I didn't stand by you as I should have. This trust is small repayment for the countless sacrifices you made silently. My final wish isn't about money or property. It's that you live freely. Laugh boldly. And never shrink yourself for someone else's comfort. The world needs more of you, not less." It was signed simply. Edward. Margaret folded the letter slowly, blinking back tears. This, more than anything, was the closure she didn't know she needed. She spent the rest of the day walking through Surrey, taking familiar paths, past the bookshop where she used to meet Edward on Thursdays, the flower stall where they once picked out lilies for her mother, and the park bench where they had shared one of their very first conversations. With each step, she felt the weight of grief gently lift, replaced by a quiet peace. That evening, she rang Daniel. "He left me more than I thought," she said softly. "Not just in money, but in words I waited years to hear." Daniel's voice, warm and reassuring, replied, "It's a testament to the life you live together, even through the flaws." As the days passed, the solicitor reached out again. With the new will, the legal case with Harrison shifted decisively. Harrison's solicitor, faced with indisputable documents, offered to withdraw their claim in exchange for a settlement. Margaret, after careful thought, refused. She didn't want compromise. She wanted clarity. And for once, the law was firmly on her side. When the matter was finally closed, Daniel invited Margaret to a small gathering at his home in Hampstead. It was a modest celebration, filled with a few old friends, tea, laughter, and soft piano music playing in the background. But the moment Margaret would remember most was when Daniel raised a toast. "To Margaret Whitmore," he said, lifting his glass, "who weathered storms with grace, faced betrayal with poise, and proved that quiet strength is sometimes the loudest power of all." Margaret smiled. Not because she needed recognition, but because, in that room, surrounded by warmth, she felt truly seen. Later, as she left Daniel's home and stepped out into the soft London night, she whispered a quiet thank you to Edward. For the good and the flawed. For the past and what it led to. For finally giving her the freedom to begin again. It was a quiet Tuesday morning when the bell above the tea shop door rang with a chime. Margaret looked up from the counter, expecting to see one of her regulars, perhaps Mrs. Ellery with her fondness for chamomile, or the young couple from across the street who always bickered affectionately over which scone to share. But instead, there stood a figure she hadn't seen in weeks. Harrison Whitmore. He looked different. Not in the tailored way he usually presented himself at formal dinners or board meetings. Today, he wore a soft wool jumper and jeans. His hair, once so immaculately parted, had fallen slightly over his brow. His eyes, once sharp, proud, now carried something else entirely. Regret. Margaret's heart didn't race, nor did she stiffen. Instead, she placed the teacup she had been polishing gently on the shelf and met his gaze. "I wasn't expecting you," she said plainly. "I know," Harrison replied, his voice quieter than she remembered. "But I needed to come." He didn't sit. He simply stood, glancing around the shop as though seeing it properly for the first time. The mismatched chairs. The sunlight streaming through the lace curtains. The corner shelf with the photographs of Edward, young and grinning, and older, more solemn, holding a teacup beside Margaret at the shop's first anniversary. "I thought this place was silly when Dad bought it," Harrison murmured, still not meeting her eyes. "I thought it was some sort of distraction from everything going wrong in his life." Margaret crossed her arms lightly. "And now? Now I realize it was the one place he found peace." He finally looked at her. There was no arrogance in his posture now. No entitlement. Just the quiet expression of a man who had misjudged everything and was now left to sit with the weight of his own choices. "I came to apologize," he said. "Not for the legal mess, though I should, but for everything before that. The way I treated you. The way I assumed that I was owed something, simply because I was his son." Margaret didn't answer immediately. She moved behind the counter, poured 2 cups of Earl Grey, and set them on a table near the window. She gestured silently for him to sit. He hesitated, then walked over and took the seat opposite her. They sat in silence for a moment, the clink of the spoon against porcelain the only sound between them. "I never wanted your father's money," she said softly. "Not in the way you thought. I wanted respect. I wanted to be seen. For the life we built together to be honored." Harrison nodded, his shoulders falling. "I know that now. And I don't expect forgiveness. But I needed you to know that." I see it. I see you. Outside, a light rain began to fall, misting the windows. Inside, the warmth of the shop glowed against the grey. He stayed for nearly an hour. They didn't talk much after that. But when he stood to leave, he paused at the doorway. "Margaret," he said, "whatever you choose to do next, I hope it brings you joy. Real joy." And then, he was gone. As the door closed behind him, Margaret stood in the silence, her heart calm. Not healed completely, healing wasn't a destination, she had learned, but a long walk with uneven steps. But today, the step had landed softly. Weeks passed, and life found a new rhythm. She expanded the tea shop's back garden, turning it into a sunroom filled with lavender, lemon balm, and rosehip. People came from nearby villages just to sit among the scents and sip her famous cinnamon blend. Daniel continued to visit, always bringing a new book or a box of shortbread. They never rushed things. Their bond was quiet, sincere, built not on filling empty spaces but on honoring what they both had lost and what they still hoped to find. One spring morning, Margaret received a letter with elegant handwriting. It was from Olivia, Harrison's wife. "Dear Margaret, I wanted to thank you, not only for what you did for Edward, but for allowing Harrison to see a better path. He came home different that day. Softer. More present. I believe your kindness was the start of it. With gratitude, Olivia." Margaret smiled, folded the letter, and placed it in a wooden box in the tea shop's storeroom, where she kept notes and memories, some joyful, others painful, all of them part of her story. On the shop's 5th anniversary, Daniel insisted they host a small celebration. The room was filled with familiar faces, soft music, and the scent of fresh scones. Margaret stood near the window, watching the laughter ripple through the room, and for the first time in a long time, she felt something powerful. Home. Not a house, not even the shop itself, but the feeling of being right where she belonged, finally, unquestionably, and with no one's permission but her own. She raised her teacup, not in toast, not in ceremony, just a quiet moment for herself. And whispered, more to the air than to anyone nearby, "I'm still standing." And indeed, she was.